Billionaire's Paralyzed Triplets never walked until the new Maid did, the impossible that shocked everyone. Richard Castellano built his fortune the way most billionaires do, by sacrificing everything else. 16-hour days, cross-continental flights, deals closed in hotel rooms at 3 in the morning. By 38, he owned the third largest commercial real estate empire in North America, 12 billion in assets, properties in 47 cities, his name on buildings from Manhattan to Singapore. But none of it prepared him for the call that came on a Tuesday afternoon in March. His wife, Isabella, 7 months pregnant with triplets, collapsed during a charity luncheon. Placental abruption, emergency C-section. 3 boys delivered at 29 weeks, tiny, struggling, fighting for every breath in incubators that hummed like machines keeping hope alive. Isabella never woke up. The doctors tried everything: transfusions, emergency procedures, prayers whispered by nurses who'd seen too many miracles fail. But sometimes the body simply decides it's done. 23 hours after delivering their sons, Isabella Castellano died in a recovery room, while Richard sat 3 floors up in the NICU, staring at 3 isolates he didn't know how to love yet. Matteo, Sebastian, Lucas, 2 pounds each, translucent skin, tubes and wires covering more of them than Richard could see. The neonatologist's words came in fragments he couldn't quite process. Underdeveloped lungs, potential complications, brain bleeds, cerebral palsy. Too early to know the extent. Richard heard it all, understood none of it. He buried Isabella on a Thursday. The boys stayed in the hospital for 96 days. And somewhere in those 3 months between funeral and homecoming, Richard Castellano stopped being a man and became a machine. Because machines don't break, machines don't feel. Machines just execute the plan. When the boys finally came home to the Connecticut estate, 14,000 square feet of stone and glass overlooking Long Island Sound, they came with nurses, equipment, and a diagnosis that landed like a second death. Severe spastic cerebral palsy, all 3 boys. The neurologist showed Richard brain scans, explained damage patterns, outlined what the boys would never do. They'll require full-time care, Mr. Castellano. Mobility will be extremely limited. Walking. He paused, chose his words carefully. Walking is not something we anticipate. The neural pathways simply aren't there. Richard sat in that sterile office, nodded at the right moments, asked logical questions about equipment and therapy protocols. Inside, something fundamental cracked. Isabella had wanted these boys more than anything. 5 years of trying, 3 rounds of IVF. When she finally got pregnant with triplets, she'd cried for 2 days straight, happy tears, the kind that come when impossible becomes real. She'd designed their nursery herself, soft grey walls, a painted mural of 3 trees intertwined at the roots, 3 cribs arranged so the boys could see each other when they woke. Brothers should always know they're not alone, she'd said, one hand on her swollen belly, eyes bright with a future she'd never see. That nursery sat empty now. The boys slept in the medical suite. Richard had constructed 3 adjustable hospital beds, monitors tracking every breath, oxygen tanks on standby, enough equipment to run a small clinic. The room with the painted trees became storage for therapy devices they'd tried once and abandoned. Richard hired the best: pediatric specialists from Johns Hopkins, physical therapists who'd worked with Olympic athletes, occupational therapists with decades of experience. He purchased equipment that cost more than most people earned in a year: standing frames, adaptive seating systems, sensory integration tools. Nothing changed. The boys didn't improve. They sat in custom wheelchairs, small bodies rigid, eyes distant, fingers curled inward. At 2 years old, they couldn't hold their heads steady, couldn't reach for toys, couldn't make sounds beyond reflexive cries. The therapists came 3 times a week, moved the boys' limbs through prescribed patterns, documented lack of progress in clinical language. Minimal response to stimuli, no voluntary movement observed. Prognosis remains unchanged. Richard read every report, signed every check, accepted what the experts told him. His sons would never walk, never run, never chase each other through hallways the way he'd once imagined late at night when Isabella was still alive and hope felt possible. He buried that dream right next to her grave. The estate became a museum. Beautiful, expensive, dead. Richard worked from his office on the 2nd floor, massive windows overlooking grounds he never walked anymore. Mahogany desk imported from England, 3 monitors displaying real-time market data. He left for the city at 6 in the morning, returned after the boys were asleep, lived entire weeks without touching them. The nursing staff handled everything: medications, feedings, hygiene, therapy schedules. Richard reviewed their reports the way he reviewed quarterly earnings, clinically, detached, looking for problems to solve rather than children to know. He told himself he was providing everything they needed. The best care money could buy: safety, stability, structure. He was providing everything except himself. The cameras came after caregiver number 7, Maria Santos, 52 years old, 20 years of pediatric nursing experience, impeccable references. She lasted 6 months before Richard discovered she'd been selling photos of his sons to tabloid websites, medical equipment in the background, headlines screaming, "Tragic billionaire babies," and Castellano's cursed children. $12,000. That's what his son's suffering was worth to her. Richard fired her on the spot. Then he called a security firm. Within a week, his home had 43 cameras. Every hallway, every room except bathrooms, motion sensors, audio recording, live feeds accessible from his phone, his laptop, his office monitors. He could watch every corner of his house from anywhere in the world. Control became his only protection. He started reviewing footage obsessively, 2 hours every night, sometimes more, watching caregivers interact with his sons, looking for the moment the lie, the theft, the betrayal he knew was coming, because they always came. Caregiver number 1 quit after 2 weeks. "I can't watch children suffer," she'd said, as if his son's existence was suffering, as if their lives were something to endure rather than nurture. Number 2 spent more time on her phone than with the boys. Richard caught her on camera scrolling through social media while Matteo cried in his chair, ignored for 18 minutes straight. Number 3 seemed perfect until he discovered she was accessing his personal financial accounts, copying passwords from papers left on his desk. Number 4 stole prescription medications. Number 5 brought her boyfriend into the house when she thought Richard was traveling. Number 6 fell asleep during her shift, while one of the boys, Sebastian, Richard would later learn from reviewing footage, choked on his feeding tube. Richard caught it on camera, saw his son's distress, saw the caregiver passed out on the couch, saw himself rushing in from the hallway, clearing the tube, holding Sebastian until the coughing stopped. He didn't trust anyone after that. Number 7 was the tabloid leak. Number 8 lasted 3 days before admitting she wasn't equipped for special needs children. Number 9 stole jewelry from Isabella's vanity pieces Richard hadn't been able to look at, let alone move. Number 10 accessed his email and sold information about pending deals to a competitor. Number 11 quit without explanation after 6 weeks, left a resignation letter on the kitchen counter, gone before Richard got home. 11 caregivers in 22 months. 11 failures, 11 betrayals, 11 reasons to believe the next one would be exactly the same. Richard stopped seeing people. He saw risks, variables, potential disasters waiting to happen. He watched his monitors at night, scrolling through footage, zooming in on details, looking for signs he'd missed before. The way someone's eyes lingered too long on valuable objects, the way they touched the boys or didn't touch them, the tone of voice they used when they thought no one was listening. He documented everything, built profiles, created spreadsheets tracking each caregiver's behavior patterns, looking for predictors of failure. Isabella would have hated what he'd become. She'd believed in people, trusted easily, saw the best in everyone until they proved otherwise. "You can't live in fear, Richard," she'd once told him during a business negotiation gone wrong. "Sometimes you have to believe in good faith and let people surprise you." But Isabella hadn't lived long enough to be betrayed this many times. Elena Morales walked through his front door on a cold November morning, carrying nothing but a worn canvas bag and quiet dignity. 27 years old. Nursing student at Southern Connecticut State University, working 3 part-time jobs while finishing her degree. Her application listed previous experience in pediatric home care, references from 2 families, a background check that came back clean. Richard didn't care about any of that. He cared that she was number 12, that she'd probably last 3 weeks before quitting or stealing or proving herself worthless like all the others, that he was exhausted from this cycle but had no choice except to keep repeating it. The interview took place in his office. Elena sat across from him, hands folded in her lap, meeting his eyes without flinching when he asked invasive questions designed to intimidate. "Why do you want this position?" "I need the income to finish school, but also..." She paused. I grew up with a younger brother who has Down syndrome. I understand what families like yours need. Not just medical care. Presence. Richard's jaw tightened. He didn't want presence. He wanted competence and boundaries. These are not normal children, he said flatly. They require specialized medical attention. They don't respond to stimuli. They can't communicate. The doctors have made their prognosis very clear. There will be no miraculous improvement. I understand. Do you? Richard leaned forward. Because I don't need optimism. I don't need someone who thinks they can fix what specialists couldn't. I need someone who follows the medical protocol exactly. No improvising, no bonding, no hope speeches that mean nothing. Elena's expression didn't change. What do the boys need? The question caught him off guard. Excuse me, you've told me what you need from me. What do Matteo, Sebastian, and Lucas need? Richard stared at her. No one had asked him that before. Not in those words. They need, he faltered. They need their medications administered on schedule. Physical therapy protocols followed. Feeding times maintained. Safety protocols observed. Elena nodded slowly. Okay. Something in her tone made Richard's shoulders tense. That's all. Nothing more. Are we clear? Crystal clear, Mr. Castellano. He showed her the medical suite. 3 hospital beds arranged in an L shape. Equipment lining the walls. The monitoring system that tracked vitals 24 hours a day. Everything sterile, clinical, efficient. Elena walked to each bed slowly, looked at each boy for a long moment, not at their equipment or their diagnosis. At their faces, Matteo had dark curls like Isabella. Sebastian had Richard's nose. Lucas had the longest eyelashes Richard had ever seen on a child. Elena touched Lucas's hand gently. Hello, sweet boy. I'm Elena. I'm here to take care of you. Lucas didn't respond, didn't move. His eyes stayed fixed on the ceiling, same as always. I told you, Richard said from the doorway. They don't. I know what you told me. Elena's voice stayed soft. I heard you. She moved to Sebastian, then Matteo, greeting each boy like they could understand, like they mattered beyond their medical charts. Richard watched through the doorway, something uncomfortable twisting in his chest. The cameras, he said abruptly. There are cameras in every room, audio and video. I review all footage. If you have a problem with that, you can leave now. Elena looked at him steadily. I have nothing to hide, Mr. Castellano. She started that afternoon. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The first 3 days, Elena followed every rule perfectly. Richard watched her through his monitors. She arrived at 7 every morning, reviewed the overnight nurse's notes, administered medications at exact prescribed times. She followed the physical therapy protocols down to the minute 15 minutes of passive range of motion exercises per child, documented in the log with clinical precision. She was competent, professional, exactly what he'd asked for. Then, on day 4, she brought music. Richard was in his office reviewing acquisition proposals when he noticed it through the audio feed. Soft guitar, gentle melody, something classical he didn't recognize. He pulled up the medical suite camera. Elena had a small speaker on the shelf. Nothing expensive, just a portable device she'd pulled from her canvas bag. She was moving Matteo's legs through therapy exercises, but instead of the silence he'd prescribed, there was music filling the room. Richard's hand hovered over the intercom button. This wasn't protocol. The boys had specific sound therapy sessions on Wednesdays with a licensed audiologist. Random music wasn't part of the plan. But Matteo's head turned, just slightly, maybe 3 degrees to the right, toward the sound. Richard leaned closer to the screen. His son, who spent most days staring straight ahead at nothing, had responded to something. Elena noticed too. She didn't make a fuss, didn't celebrate, just smiled softly and adjusted the volume slightly higher. Then she continued the exercises, humming along with the melody. Sebastian's fingers twitched against his bed rail. Richard's throat went tight. He didn't press the intercom button, told himself he was giving her a chance to correct the violation on her own, that he'd address it later if she repeated it. But the next morning, the music came back, and the morning after that. By the end of week 1, Elena had established a routine that existed nowhere in the medical protocols Richard had established. She'd arrive, greet each boy by name, turn on music, and spend the first 15 minutes simply sitting with them, not doing therapy, not administering medications, Just present. Richard watched through his monitors, irritation building. He was paying her $18 an hour more than the going rate to work, not to sit. But he noticed things he couldn't explain. Matteo turned his head more consistently, always toward Elena's voice, always when she was speaking directly to him. Sebastian's hands, usually curled tight into fists, relaxed when she placed them on the soft blanket she'd brought from home. Feel that texture, Sebastian? Soft, right? Different from the sheets. Lucas, who kept his eyes closed most days, opened them when Elena sang. Not just opened them, tracked her movement across the room. Small things, maybe meaningless, probably reflexive. Richard told himself that, over and over. On day 9, Richard reviewed afternoon footage and nearly choked on his coffee. Elena was on the floor with Lucas. She had his legs in her hands and was moving them in a walking pattern, left, right, like he was marching, like his muscles remembered something his brain had never learned. This definitely wasn't in the protocol. Richard grabbed his phone, pulled up her number, finger over the call button. This was exactly what he'd told her not to do. No improvising, no experimental interventions. Then Lucas smiled. Not a big smile, barely more than a muscle twitch at the corner of his mouth, but Richard saw it clearly on the screen. His youngest son, who doctors said would never respond emotionally, was smiling. Richard set the phone down. His hand was shaking. Elena moved to Sebastian next, positioned a small toy truck just beyond his reach on the bed tray. Not far, maybe 8 inches, but far enough that he'd have to try to get it. "Come on, sweetheart," she said softly. "I know you can. Just reach a little." Sebastian's arm stayed still. Elena waited, patient, unhurried. "I believe in you," she whispered. "I believe you can do this." Richard held his breath, watching the screen. Sebastian's fingers twitched. His arm moved slowly, painfully slowly, stretching forward, trembling with effort. The movement was maybe an inch, then 2, then 3. His small fingers touched the truck. "Yes." Elena's face broke into the widest smile. "Look at you. Sebastian, look at what you just did." Sebastian's fingers curled around the plastic. He held it, actually held it. Richard's eyes burned. He rewound the footage, watched it again and again. That small arm reaching, those tiny fingers closing around plastic. Such a simple movement, something any other child would do without thinking, but his son had just done the impossible. Richard rubbed his face with both hands. This was dangerous. All of it. Elena was pushing his sons beyond what specialists said they could do. When she failed, and she would fail, the disappointment would destroy them. Destroy him. He should fire her. Tomorrow morning, first thing. But instead of drafting a termination email, Richard pulled up more footage, went back day by day, watched Elena work with his sons in ways that violated every clinical protocol he'd established, watched her hum while moving their legs, watched her talk to them like they understood, watched her place their hands on textured fabrics, play music at different volumes, position toys just out of reach over and over again, watched his sons respond. Not dramatically, not miraculously, but respond. Richard closed his laptop slowly, sat in the darkness of his office. The termination email sat unfinished in his drafts folder. He should send it. Logic demanded it. But another voice spoke, quieter, terrifying. What if she sees something the doctors missed? That night, Richard couldn't sleep. He reviewed footage until 3 in the morning, watching Elena interact with his sons in ways he'd forgotten were possible, with patience, with belief, with something that looked uncomfortably like love. And somewhere deep in his chest, in a place he'd locked away since Isabella died, something started to crack. He didn't trust it, couldn't trust it, because hope, when you've buried it that deep, doesn't feel like relief. It feels like a trap. Week 3 arrived, and Richard had stopped pretending he wasn't obsessed. Every night after the house went dark, he'd sit in his office pulling up hours of footage, fast-forwarding through empty hallways, pausing on moments that made his chest tight, rewinding scenes he needed to see, again and again. Elena had transformed the medical suite. Not dramatically, she hadn't violated his rules about major changes, but small things had shifted. She'd moved the boys' beds closer together so they could see each other, replaced the sterile white blankets with soft blue ones she'd brought from home, added a small plant by the window, something green and alive. Richard hadn't stopped her. Should have. It wasn't protocol. But watching that room transform from clinical to warm did something to him he couldn't name. Then the real changes started showing up in places he couldn't ignore. Thursday afternoon, the licensed physical therapist arrived for the boys' weekly session. Dr. Patterson had been coming for 14 months. Richard watched through the camera as she examined each child: muscle tone, joint flexibility, reflexes, standard assessment. She started with Matteo, moved his arm through its range of motion, then his leg. Her hands paused. She did it again, slower this time. Lifted his leg, bent the knee, extended it. Her face showed something Richard had never seen before: surprise. Dr. Patterson called Elena over. They spoke quietly, heads bent together. Richard turned up the volume, caught fragments. Significant improvement in muscle tone. This is unusual for this diagnosis. What specific exercises have you been doing? Elena explained something, gesturing with her hands, demonstrating the walking patterns, the reaching exercises, the repetitive movements she'd been doing daily. Dr. Patterson nodded slowly, writing on her clipboard. Then she moved to Sebastian and Lucas, examining them with renewed attention. Her professional mask slipped several times, eyebrows raising, head tilting, small sounds of acknowledgement. When she left an hour later, she paused at the door, looked back at the boys, then at Elena. "Keep doing whatever you're doing," she said clearly. "I'll adjust the official protocol to include your methods. This is," she searched for words, "this is remarkable progress." Richard sat back in his chair. His heart was pounding. That night, he didn't just watch current footage. He went back systematically, day by day, week by week, building a timeline of changes he'd been too afraid to acknowledge. Week 1. Matteo turning his head toward Elena's voice. Small movement, but consistent. Week 2. Sebastian's fingers uncurling when Elena placed soft textures in his hands, holding objects for 3 seconds, then 5, then 10. Week 3. Lucas opening his eyes more frequently, tracking Elena's movement across the room, making eye contact that lasted longer each day. Richard pulled up footage from the day Elena started. The boys sat vacant in their beds, distant, unreachable. Then footage from yesterday. Matteo reaching for a toy across his tray. Sebastian's foot tapping slightly to music. Lucas holding his head steady for almost 30 seconds, eyes following Elena as she moved around the room. The difference was undeniable. Richard's hands trembled on the keyboard. He opened a new browser window, typed with shaking fingers. Neuroplasticity, cerebral palsy, children. Articles flooded the screen. Medical journals from universities he recognized. Research papers from institutions he'd donated to but never read. He clicked the first one. Early intervention in pediatric cerebral palsy cases has shown remarkable results in neural pathway development through consistent, repetitive motor pattern training. Another, the infant and toddler brain demonstrates extraordinary plasticity. With targeted intervention, children with CP have achieved mobility outcomes far exceeding initial prognosis. And another, repetitive movement patterns can stimulate the brain to form new neural connections, bypassing damaged areas through alternative pathways. Richard read until his eyes burned, until the words blurred together, until 4 in the morning crept past and the house sat silent around him. Everything Elena had said, neural pathways, brain plasticity, the importance of early intervention and belief, it was all there, published, peer-reviewed, real, and he'd never looked. Not once in 2 years. He'd taken those first neurologists at their word, accepted their verdict like a death sentence, stopped researching, stopped questioning, stopped hoping. Richard closed the laptop and sat in darkness. His sons were improving, actually improving, doing things those initial specialists said they'd never do, and he'd almost fired the woman responsible. Twice, his stomach turned. For 2 years, he'd poured millions into maintaining his son's limitations. Expensive wheelchairs, adaptive equipment, nurses who kept them comfortable in their diagnosis, but he'd never once fought for something more. Elena had been here 3 weeks, making $18 an hour, and she'd accomplished what his fortune hadn't touched, because she believed, and he'd stopped believing the day Isabella died. The shame was crushing, physical. Richard pressed his palms against his eyes until colors burst behind his lids. He'd failed his sons, not by loving them too little, but by expecting too little, by accepting defeat before the fight even started. Isabella would never have accepted it. She would have researched every journal, consulted every specialist, tried every method until something worked. But Isabella was gone, and Richard had buried his fight with her. Until Elena walked through his door and showed him what he'd forgotten, that giving up was a choice he'd been making every single day. It happened on a Thursday afternoon. Richard sat in his office reviewing quarterly projections for his Singapore development. Numbers that should have mattered. Deals worth hundreds of millions. His phone buzzed. Motion alert. Living room. Richard frowned. The boys were supposed to be in the medical suite at this hour. Elena followed the schedule religiously, therapy until 3, then quiet time in their beds. He picked up his phone, opened the security app, expecting to see her moving them for a diaper change or medication. The image took a moment to register. 3 wheelchairs sat against the wall, empty. Richard's stomach dropped. His first thought was panic. Something happened. An emergency. The nurse had to rush them somewhere. Then he saw them. Center of the living room. Hardwood floor gleaming in the afternoon light streaming through the windows. Matteo. Sebastian. Lucas. Standing. Richard's breath stopped in his throat. His 3 sons, his paralyzed sons, the boys doctors said would never stand, would never bear their own weight, would spend their lives in wheelchairs. They were upright, wobbly, shaking, but standing on their own 2 feet. Elena knelt on the floor about 6 feet away. Her arms stretched wide open, tears streamed down her face, but she was smiling. "Come on, babies," she whispered. "Come to me. You can do it. 1 step. Just 1 step." Richard couldn't breathe, couldn't move, couldn't process what he was seeing. Matteo moved first. His small foot lifted from the ground, hovered in the air for an endless moment, then landed again, an inch forward. A step. Richard's hand flew to his mouth. A sound escaped his throat, something between a gasp and a sob. Sebastian went next, more cautious. His legs trembled violently, like they might give out any second, but he moved, 1 foot, then the other. 2 steps. Lucas, the smallest, the one who kept his eyes closed most days, stood there shaking, his arms out for balance, his face showing concentration Richard had never seen before. Elena reached toward him. "You can do it, sweet boy. I'm right here. I'm not going anywhere." Lucas's foot lifted. It came down. Another lift. Another step. 3 steps. Richard watched his youngest son walk toward Elena's outstretched arms. His phone slipped from his fingers, clattered against the desk. He didn't hear it. His knees buckled. Richard slid down from his chair, back scraping against the desk until he sat on the floor of his office. His legs wouldn't hold him. His whole body shook. On the phone screen, face down but still playing audio, he could hear Elena's voice breaking with joy. "Yes, oh my God, yes, look at you. Look at what you're doing." The boys reached her. She gathered all 3 into her arms, pulling them against her chest, openly sobbing. "I knew it," she cried. "I knew you could. I knew it. I knew it." Richard sat on his office floor, unable to move. Tears poured down his face. His whole body shook with sobs he couldn't control. 2 years. 2 years of specialists saying never. 2 years of accepting impossible as final. 2 years of believing his sons would spend their lives unable to walk, unable to move independently, unable to experience the world on their own terms. And there they were, standing, walking, reaching toward a woman who refused to believe what the world told her. Richard pressed both hands against his face and wept. Not quiet tears, not controlled grief. This was something breaking open inside him, something that had been locked away since the day Isabella died in that recovery room. Every failure, every betrayal, every night spent watching screens instead of holding his sons. The shame, the fear, the hope he'd buried so deep he forgot it existed. It all came flooding out in waves that shook his entire body. His sons could walk. His sons could walk. And he'd almost given up on them. Almost fired the only person who believed they could be more than their diagnosis. Richard didn't know how long he sat on that floor. Minutes, maybe longer. When he finally found the strength to stand, his legs felt hollow, like they'd been replaced with something that didn't quite work. He grabbed the edge of the desk, pulled himself up. His reflection in the dark computer monitor showed a man he barely recognized. Red eyes, wet face, tie askew, hair disheveled. He looked destroyed. He felt reborn. Richard walked out of his office on unsteady feet. Down the long hallway, past the empty picture frames on the walls, past the silence he'd built around himself like armor, the living room door stood open. He stopped in the doorway. Elena sat on the floor with all 3 boys in her lap. They were exhausted from the effort, small bodies limp against her chest, breathing hard. She held them like they were made of something infinitely precious. Her face was wet with tears, but she was smiling. She looked up when she sensed him there. Their eyes met. Richard expected to see triumph in her face, pride, a look that said, "I told you so. I was right and you were wrong." But that's not what he saw. He saw compassion. For him, gentle understanding of what this moment was costing him to witness. Elena didn't say anything, just watched him with those steady brown eyes, holding his sons the way she'd always held them, like they mattered. Richard's legs gave out again. He fell to his knees in the doorway, unable to take another step, unable to stand under the weight of what he was feeling. "How?" His voice cracked, barely more than a whisper. "How did you know?" Elena looked down at the boys, then back at him. Her voice was soft, gentle. "I didn't know, Mr. Castellano. I just believed." Something broke inside Richard, the last wall, the final barrier he'd built between himself and the truth. He crawled forward on his knees until he reached them. His hands shook as he touched Matteo's face, then Sebastian's, then Lucas's, his sons. For 2 years, he'd watched them through screens, loved them from a distance, kept his heart locked away because losing more would kill him. But they were here, alive, fighting, growing, and he'd almost missed it. Richard gathered all 3 boys into his arms, pressed his face against their small heads, breathed in their scent baby shampoo and something uniquely theirs. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm so sorry." He said it over and over, an apology for every day he'd spent hiding, every night he'd chosen fear over faith, every moment he'd let grief steal what remained. Elena quietly moved back, giving him space. But Richard reached out and grabbed her hand. "Stay," he said, his voice breaking. "Please." She nodded. "I'm not going anywhere." They sat there together on the living room floor, a broken father holding his sons, a faithful woman who'd refused to give up. 3 wheelchairs pushed against the wall no longer needed, at least not in this moment. Richard looked at Elena through blurred vision. "You gave them their legs," he said. She shook her head slowly. "No, Mr. Castellano. They gave themselves their legs. I just reminded them they could try." Richard closed his eyes. Isabella would have loved this woman, would have loved this moment. And somewhere he'd stopped believing in but desperately wanted to. Now he thought maybe she was watching. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The afternoon light shifted through the windows, casting long shadows across the floor. The house felt different now. Not empty, not abandoned, alive. Richard held his sons tighter and let himself feel something he'd forgotten existed. Hope. Not fragile hope, not cautious hope, real hope. The kind that costs everything and gives back more. "What do we do now?" he asked quietly. Elena smiled. "Now, we keep going. This was the first step. There will be hundreds more. Some days will be better than others. Progress isn't a straight line." Richard nodded. He understood that. His business had taught him that success was built on small, consistent actions repeated over time. Why had he never applied that same principle to his sons? "I want to help," he said. "Teach me. Show me what to do." Elena's expression softened. "Okay, but Mr. Castellano, you have to actually be here, not watching through cameras. Here, present, on this floor with them." The words landed like a challenge. Richard thought about his schedule. The deals pending, the meetings scheduled for the next 3 months, the empire that demanded his constant attention. Then he looked at Matteo's face, his son's dark eyes watching him with something that might have been curiosity, maybe recognition. "I'll restructure everything," Richard said. It wasn't a question, it was a decision. "I'll work from home 3 days a week, cancel the overseas trips, hire someone to handle the Singapore project." "You'd do that?" "I should have done it 2 years ago." That evening, Richard made calls. Lots of calls. He informed his executive team he'd be working remotely most of the week. He delegated the Singapore development to his VP of International Operations, a man he'd been grooming for larger responsibilities anyway. He cancelled a speaking engagement in London, postponed a meeting with investors in Dubai. His COO sounded concerned. "Richard, are you all right? This isn't like you." "I'm fine. Better than fine. I'm finally figuring out what actually matters." Over the next few weeks, everything changed. Richard cleared his schedule every morning to be with the boys during therapy time. Elena showed him the walking patterns, the reaching exercises, the way to position their legs to build muscle memory. At first, His sons seemed confused by his presence. They'd watch him with uncertain eyes, like they weren't sure who this man was or why he was suddenly there. But slowly, so slowly, they started responding to him. Matteo would reach for Richard's hand during exercises. Sebastian smiled when Richard sang to him, even though Richard couldn't carry a tune to save his life. Lucas began opening his eyes more when Richard was in the room, tracking his father's movements like he was trying to figure something out. Richard learned things he should have known from the beginning. That Matteo got frustrated easily and needed gentle encouragement. That Sebastian responded better to music, with a strong beat. That Lucas was the observer. He'd watch his brothers attempt something, then try it himself once he'd studied their technique. He learned their sounds, their rhythms, the difference between a cry of discomfort and a cry of effort. The way their breathing changed when they were tired versus when they were concentrating. He was learning his children, and they were learning him. One evening, Richard was helping Lucas with standing exercises, holding his son's small hands, helping him bear weight on his trembling legs. 10 seconds, 15, 20. Lucas looked up at him, made a sound. Da. Richard's breath caught. What did you say, buddy? Da. Da. His youngest son was trying to say, Dada. Richard's eyes flooded. He pulled Lucas into his arms, held him against his chest. Yes, yes, I'm here. Dada's here. Elena watched from across the room, her own eyes wet. The boys started making faster progress with both of them working together. Matteo took 5 steps in a row. Sebastian could stand unassisted for almost a minute. Lucas said 3 words, Dada, Mama, looking at a photo of Isabella, and more when he wanted to keep practicing. Richard documented everything, not in clinical reports, but in a journal he'd started keeping, recording the small victories, the setbacks, the moments that mattered. October 15. Matteo walked 7 steps today, fell at the end, but got back up and tried again. He has his mother's determination. October 22. Sebastian laughed at something Elena said. A real laugh. The most beautiful sound I've ever heard. October 30. Lucas looked at Isabella's photo and said, Mama, pretty. I had to leave the room, cried in the hallway for 10 minutes. 3 months after that afternoon in the living room, Richard sat in the medical suite, though they'd stopped calling it that. It was the boys' room now. The hospital beds had been replaced with regular toddler beds. The monitoring equipment was gone. The space looked like a nursery should have from the beginning. The boys were asleep, all 3 of them breathing softly, peacefully. Elena was organizing toys, getting ready to leave for the evening. Elena, Richard said quietly, I never properly thanked you. She looked up. You don't need to thank me. Yes, I do. You saved my sons. You saved me. Elena sat down in the rocking chair, the one that had been in storage, the one Isabella had picked out before the boys were born. Mr. Castellano, can I tell you something? Please. And call me Richard. She smiled. Richard, the first day I came here, I saw those beautiful boys, and I saw their father who'd stopped seeing them, who'd stopped seeing himself. And I thought this family needs more than a caregiver. They need someone to remind them what's possible. You did that. No, you did that. The moment you got down on that floor and held them, the moment you chose to show up instead of hide, that's when everything changed. Richard's throat tightened. I wasted 2 years. You did what you could with the grief you were carrying. But Richard, she leaned forward, Isabella wouldn't want you to waste the rest of your life too. These boys need their father. Present, engaged, believing in them. He nodded, unable to speak. Elena stood up. I'll see you tomorrow. Elena, would you? He hesitated. Would you stay for dinner? The boys eat better when you're here. And I'd like the company. She studied his face. Okay, I'll stay. 6 months later. The backyard of the Connecticut estate hadn't been used in 3 years, but on this Saturday afternoon in April, it was full of life. Richard had hired people to restore it not to perfection, but to usefulness. The grass was thick and soft, the fountain ran again, water splashing in a gentle rhythm. There were toys scattered everywhere, and 3 little boys were walking, not perfectly. Matteo still had a slight limp. Sebastian needed to hold someone's hand on uneven ground. Lucas tired quickly, and sometimes needed his wheelchair for longer outings. But they were walking, running, exploring the world on their own terms. Richard sat on a blanket watching them, Elena beside him. She'd graduated from nursing school last month. He'd offered her a full-time position, not as a caregiver, but as the boys' developmental coordinator. She'd accepted. Matteo ran up, grass stains on his knees, holding a dandelion. "Dada, look!" Richard took it carefully. "That's beautiful, buddy. What is it?" "Flower." Matteo's speech was still developing, but every new word was a gift. Sebastian and Lucas came over, both holding dandelions of their own. They'd started copying each other. If one boy did something, the others tried it too. "Should we make a wish?" Richard asked. All three boys nodded enthusiastically. They blew on the dandelions together, sending white seeds floating across the yard. The boys laughed and chased after them. Elena bumped Richard's shoulder gently. "You're doing really well." "We're doing really well," he corrected. She smiled. "Yeah, we are." Richard looked around at his three sons playing in grass they'd never touched before, at the house that finally felt like a home, at the life they'd built from broken pieces. On the blanket beside him was a framed photo of Isabella, 8 months pregnant, glowing with hope. He'd brought it outside for the first time. "Thank you," he whispered to her. "For them, for giving me another chance, for sending Elena when I'd given up." The boys ran back over, collapsing on the blanket in a heap of giggles and grass-stained clothes. "More," Lucas demanded, already trying to stand again. Richard laughed, genuinely laughed, and stood up with them. "All right, let's see who can run to the fountain first." They took off, wobbly and joyful and beautifully, impossibly alive. Elena watched Richard chase after them, heard his laughter mixing with theirs, and felt something settle in her chest. This was why she'd fought so hard. This moment, this family finding their way back to each other. As the afternoon sun painted everything golden, the Castellano family played in their backyard like they'd never forgotten how. Like hope had never left them. Like miracles were exactly what happened when someone refused to stop believing. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.